Hello, and welcome to the Decent Ideas podcast, where decent needn't necessarily mean polite in an indecent time, nor should it mean perfect for obvious reasons. What it must mean is fitting and suitable to that time. I'm Terence. So, it seemed like a good day, a good occasion to return to a recurring theme of the podcast on the culture war. And so I wanted to focus in this time on immigration. And I'm going to be doing some glossing over of certain bits of history here that I take to be pretty obvious in the interest of time. But the point here is essentially to demonstrate what I've attempted to demonstrate in previous episodes with this recurring theme of the culture war, which is that almost all politics are basically culture war politics at this point in this modern era. And as a result, none of them should be treated as such if they affect the material conditions of people. So let's delve into the history, and then we'll move on to some basic modern immigration issues. This is meant to be a bit more of a stream of consciousness episode, so bear with me. So as a reminder, defining the culture war. So culture war is a subset of cultural conflict, which is when different cultural values or beliefs clash. So a culture war is a cultural conflict between social groups and the struggle for dominance of their values, beliefs, and practices. And so again, as I'm saying, almost all politics are basically cultural war politics. And I'd be specific to our country. I don't know that this is the case in all countries, but in our neck of the woods, I would say that most all politics has become culture war politics. And perhaps we'll have time somewhere down the line to kind of resolve this theme and basically put to bed the culture war, at least as far as this podcast is concerned. But for now, let's just get into immigration as a culture war issue. So in terms of the history, I wanted to start with what I would call the previous scapegoats for immigration in our country, or for the problems associated with immigration in our country. So the two biggest ones are Italian Americans and Irish Americans, at least in my part of the country, which is Massachusetts. So basically we had a sort of strong nativist movement that culminated in the 1850s with the so-called Know Nothing Party, which was basically driven by an anti-Catholic strain in our country, based on the notion of historically our country being more of a Protestant nation that had escaped the dominion of the Pope. And so, in particular, there were two sort of main strains of Catholic immigrants into our country, which were Italian Americans and Irish Americans. Large-scale Italian immigration led to a view of them as low-skilled laborers that were stealing American jobs, which may sound familiar to you. And, similarly, Irish Americans were kind of viewed as low-skilled laborers that were lazy and that sort of thing. And basically, you can get a sense of, this being, these are the people that aren't, anxious to get ahead. These are the people that are willing to take the low-end jobs, but, they don't value them as much as us real Americans do. And so, why should they be getting our jobs? And I should probably disclose that I am, in large part, Irish American. I have a significant Irish American immigrant background. So probably should let that off at the beginning. And obviously, by the way, a large part of immigration from Ireland came as a result of the potato famine. But it was a problem. The Irish problem, if you will, preceded the potato famine and the exodus of many Irish folks from Ireland, and this was caused largely by a economic depression in Europe in the preceding years. These were two populations of large-scale immigration into Massachusetts, and you can think of sort of the way that evolved over time, from them being immigrant scapegoats to sort of assimilated white racial passing groups, if you will, as part of a couple factors. The first was, for Italians, there was sort of a myth established, if you will, of a kind to assure greater assimilation into American culture, and that was done by myth making around Columbus. And sort of establishing him as foundational to America. And this was a concerted effort by President Benjamin Harrison when he proclaimed Columbus Day in 1892. And this gets to the social construction behind race, right? In that if you look to the history, Italian Americans were, especially Southern Italian Americans, meaning Italian Americans of Southern Italy, were referred to and kind of commingled with African Americans in terms of them having a darker complexion and this sort of thing. So you start to get the sense of how these things kind of fade, and how there's a rotating villain, if you will, for immigrants as scapegoats. And I'll come back to I'll try and come back to this idea of white racial passing. We'll see if I get a chance to come back to it. But another thing we can look to as sort of the passing of the buck, if you will, for immigrant scapegoating occurred sort of as a result of World War II, which was, the U.S. patriotism that ensued, and the number of immigrants in the Allied forces of World War II appears to have quelled this overall, in the sense that there was camaraderie found through going through this terrible war together. And that appears, at least from a certain historical perspective, to have largely contributed to the degree to which the anti-Italian, anti-Irish sentiment appears to have started to drop off in this era because of these kind of factors. There was also a sort of interesting segment on the Majority Report with Sam Cedar that talked about immigration as a sort of self-contradictory cheap labor question that I found really interesting, which talked about how, basically saw immigration historically through the lens of, trying to get cheap labor when, it was scarce because of, a war, or because people were starting to abandon the sort of lower skilled jobs in search of more lucrative careers, that we use that as an opportunity to invite in more immigrants. And then of course this led to a sense among some that they're starting to take our jobs, and that it sort of led to this cyclical concern where we'd seek out immigrants for low skilled labor, and then it would reach a point where, people were having trouble finding jobs that were more lucrative. And so now it's time to start blaming the immigrants again. And I urge people to check out that segment with Dan Mello, I believe was his name, because it sort of, illustrates that this is not unintentional in the way that we have used immigration to fuel certain political goals, and then how it is transformed into more reactionary politics against immigrants. So again, I'd encourage people to check that out. Obviously, we also have a strong history, unfortunately, of white nationalism and white supremacism in our country, going back to the root of our country. And you've seen a sort of reemergence of this in the white replacement theory, which I'd encourage people to do more research on. It's not a sort of area of expertise for me in terms of the history behind it, but obviously we've seen a resurgence of it lately, and it should hopefully go without saying for my audience, but I'll make it plain that white replacement theory is a myth. So it's a myth, at least in one sense, which is the sense that it's deliberate, right? So it's not in fact deliberate. It is founded in a lot of our needs for immigrants that I've just alluded to, and the essential truth that, as we know, and as we've established, race is a social construct, right? Which is different from ethnicity. I believe we've talked about this before, but the idea that it's being deliberately done by, I believe it's like the conspiracies that globalist Jews are attempting to replace whites with immigrant populations. So one of the facts really is that the human race as a whole is largely people of color, right? In the sense that it's largely non-white people. When you look at the populations of the largest countries around the world that aren't the U.S., you're talking about China, which has, I believe it's 1.4 billion. You have India, which is 1.2 or so billion. And you have not a country, but a continent, which is Africa, which is similar, I believe, to India in terms of population, around 1.2 billion now. So you combine those three sort of broad non-white areas, if you will, and that brings you to, what's the math here? 3.8 billion. So that's, approximately, give or take, half of the planet already. And we're just talking three non-white areas, if you will. So you get the picture here, right? Which is that we see this attempt by members of this resurgent white nationalism to paint this picture of whites being replaced, of a white genocide, I believe is the other framing for this, and it being deliberate. But the fact is, this is just, it's inevitable, I guess, is the fact of it. And if you're concerned about preserving white culture, is one of the ways that white nationalists and white supremacists frame it, then you already have to re-examine what is white culture. There isn't really such a thing. There are, there's Irish culture, there's Italian culture, there's Russian culture, as much as Russians self-identify as white. There's Canadian culture, there's French culture, there's British culture. But again, this goes to this question of race as a social construct. So suffice it to say, what we're talking about here is the degree to which we frame the immigration issue as an issue of maintaining a certain racial demographic. And this is a long history in our country that we should not whitewash, if you will. So obviously, as long as the country has existed, even before it, white supremacism, white nationalism has existed and will continue to exist. But I also wanted to, touch on, the southern border, which is, a recurring issue in our politics, especially in the last, let's just say it's been made an issue increasingly since Trump descended from the escalator in 2015. But I think sometimes we use the southern border euphemistically as a stand-in for real immigration policy largely. And that is, I would argue, a huge mistake, because while Americans south of our southern border, while they make up a large percentage of our immigrant population, especially Mexicans are the largest percentage by population of immigrants in our country. So while they are the largest percentage, they are by no means the fullness of the question. And obviously, I think I've spoken to this a strong bit before, but in large part, the influx of migrants to our country is a self-inflicted wound of the drug war, and the war on drugs. I'll use those terms interchangeably, but the Mexican drug war and the U.S. choice to create a war on drugs. And so it goes to the question of, well, how do you stop a problem that you yourselves created? And the answer is, you stop calling it a problem, and you institute policy that takes into account that it doesn't have to be a problem. And I'll try and come back to that a little bit later. So I wanted to pause and just speak briefly about the difference between asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants, because these terms can be weaponized for political ends. And so it's better to, as I often say, it's better to understand the terms so that they can't be weaponized in a bad faith manner. So refugees are those that have legal status that determines that they are at risk of human rights violations, as determined by a international or national body. So that determines they're at risk of human rights violations and persecution if they're returned to their home country. Asylum seekers are those that are seeking the means to be recognized as refugees, generally speaking, but haven't yet been recognized by a body as such. And so when we talk about asylum as, a political football, we're talking about, well, do they deserve to be deemed refugees under international law? And that's, an important question, right? And that leaves kind of the sort of catch-all third term, which is just migrants, right? There isn't generally sort of a international definition for it, but basically those that don't fit either status of asylum seeker or refugee, but are generally sort of seeking a better life for themselves and for their families, and that's why they're coming to another country. So that caveat, I think, is important to just sort of, I think it's important to recognize that those differences matter and that they're often used unfairly in a way that hurts human life, frankly, of those people that fall into those categories. And so we need to be cognizant of the way that those terms are used. So obviously, I don't feel like I can talk about immigration in the U.S. without revisiting something that we just observed the anniversary of, which was 9/11. And obviously, the consequences of 9/11 on immigration are immense in terms of, what we do at our airports, obviously, but also who we are likely to accept in as immigrants into our country. And the fact is, you need only look to very recent history and Trump's Muslim ban to find that, we have that essentially, Muslims from around the world represent one of those newer immigrant scapegoats for the woes of America. And as I've discussed, I think with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which hopefully will be finalized, along with from Iraq as well, that we'll start to see this fade as an issue. I'm not betting on it, but hopefully this is a direction that we're moving in that's proper. And so I've spoken to, Trump using immigration as a wedge issue, and it's just a fact of the matter that, if it wasn't a culture war issue before, and you can point to points in recent history with the, migrant crisis at the border in 2014, which was when we started separating children at the border and started putting families in cages. This needs to be a matter of historical record that it didn't start with Trump. He did make it much worse. I think it's fair to argue, but he did not start this policy. So while we recognize that he didn't start it, he did make it much worse. And because he made it much worse and used it as an issue to try to motivate his voters, I would argue quite successfully in both elections, even though he didn't win in 2020. He came quite close. So we have to recognize that, this is part of the new normal, whether he's telling his voters that, Mexico isn't sending their best, or he's telling us to stay away from letting people in from those S-hole countries, or he's telling us that we need to, shut down all migration from countries with majority Muslim populations, because until we figure out what's going on, right? This is a great microcosm of the degree to which immigration has become a culture war issue. And then obviously this brings us to, the reason for the episode, if you will, which is the most recent Haitian crisis. So just for the sake of those who aren't as informed and are looking to become more informed on this, the fact is that when we look at how Haiti ended up in Del Rio, Texas, which is, landlocked on the Texas-Mexico border, the fact is that Haiti has been economically and physically ravaged with a large transitory population that's shuffled around the hemisphere for a long time, but increasingly since the hurricanes that have ravaged the country, with their a number of them went to Brazil to obtain work, both with the recent World Cup that was held there, as well as with the recent Olympics that were held there, and have basically shuffled around the continent in search of work, with the political instability that has resulted, and the degree to which, honestly, we've sowed instability there as a country. And I won't go too much into it because many people have done it better than I have in discussing it. And I'm still educating myself, to be honest, on that matter. But the fact is that we have contributed to the instability there, that we have sought, as I've said in recent episodes, favorable trading relationships at the expense of democracy there. And that's just a fact of the matter. And I encourage people to look into the history, and maybe I'll have an opportunity to come back to that in a future episode. In any case, there also I wanted to point to another discussion of this issue that was done very well. And the most recent kind of political upheaval around those immigrants, and the alleged use of whips at the border. And there was that viral image. And it turns out that it wasn't really a whip, at least as described by, I believe it was the State Department, that it was just a type of way to control a horse. It's the type of reins being used, and that it was actually used to control the horse rather than to whip the individual. But what they brought up, this was brought up on the Useful Idiots podcast / stream by Matt Taibbi and Katie Halper. They got into a really interesting discussion that I encourage people to check out about the sort of signifiers that basically got it to our attention, as opposed to the real policy. So when I talk about the signifiers, I'm talking about, in the case of Haitians, I'm talking about whips, right, which led to this huge outcry. And you can think of another sort of recent signifier, which is the cages, right? The cages of children. And obviously, it relates directly to this other thing, which is the policy. But we so often tend to focus on the signifiers rather than the policy. So on the policy side, in the case of the Haitians, they were actually deported. They were flown out from the border and flown directly to Haiti. So that's the policy, right? They're being flown to the place that they had sought directly to get away from. And unfortunately, that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking just about, this particular instance that turned out to be, at least as we understand it currently, not really the problem, right? And not even necessarily true. And, similarly, in the case of southern border, the more sort of recurrent recently case of migrants at the border, those from Mexico, those from the Northern Triangle countries, the policy is, literally to dissuade them from coming at all, with this sort of, terrible policy of separating kids at the border from their families, and of essentially turning them back, right? We heard not too long ago from Vice President Kamala Harris, do not come, which is, I'm going to be just really frank here, in contravention of international law to say that people cannot seek asylum. And we need to recognize that when it happens. So I wanted to just sort of tease at that sort of discussion that I think the Useful Idiots podcast delved into really well, this sort of relationship between the signifiers and the actual policy. And it's the policy that we need to change. So I wanted to, sort of as we're getting to the end here, I wanted to talk about the sort of truth of the matter of immigration in our country. So the fact is that, we talk about them as an economic drag on our country, but the fact is that they pay a great deal in taxes. They're not tax avoiders. And in fact, they are significant job creators in our country. Also, they're not criminals, at least statistically speaking. Statistically speaking, they have a lower rate of crime than native-born U.S. citizens. Another thing you'll hear from the right is that the country is full, right? We don't have room. And the fact is that it's called, when we talk about these things, we're talking about it being a scapegoat for a reason. It's more a question of how much the U.S. values its people and is willing to consider them as people first. So when we talk about the country being full, it's not because we don't have enough jobs, although we do have a job problem in the U.S., and generally I'd argue it's more a wage problem than a job problem. So if we're considering, U.S. citizens first, and we're considering asylum seekers first, then we might be looking more at a sustainable solution. So just to kind of the decent ideas of the day in brief, we should stop making other countries problematic by providing aid and encouraging reform so that people are less likely to flee their countries. And that goes to, encouraging democratic reform or discouraging democratic reform, and, being willing to work with those other countries to get them to a place where the standard of living is more sustainable. And in line with that, we should also make legal immigration more plausible and more humane, because violence isn't working, frankly. People are still coming. And I'll hazard a hot take here. I think the fact is that now when people see how much we fight against them coming here, it might suggest to some that actually means that what we're keeping them from, it might actually be something really good and something worth fighting for. So that's why I would argue, at least on the border, that violence isn't working. And when I say making it more plausible and more humane, I mean more immigrant judges. I mean less detention, because the fact is that when I say that immigrants are not statistically more likely to be criminals than native-born Americans, that also goes for appearing in court. If they're told that they need to appear in court, as our immigration system generally works, or generally has worked, I should say, they're quote unquote released into the country, but they're given a court date so that they can return and their asylum case can be fully adjudicated. And the fact is that generally speaking, statistically speaking, it's a huge percentage that actually return for their hearings. And so when it comes to making it more plausible and more humane, these are some things we can do. And then the last fact is we need to make it more livable for everyone who's here, so there's no reason to scapegoat immigrants. And that means, actually dealing with issues of poverty, actually using the spending power that we have as a country, as a currency issuer. If you're a modern monetary theory person, there are ways of getting to this place, to a good place here. So yeah, I just wanted to, get into this issue of immigration in the context of what's going on, and just have, kind of a frank conversation with you about where I'm standing at this point in light of the history on immigration. And obviously it's very tied to, kind of racial issues, as I tried to make evident here. But I thought, it was important in light of what's going on with the Haitian migrants that have now been deported, and in light of the history, it was important to kind of flesh that out, both for myself and for my audience, in hopes that it might be something of value. So I think I'll leave it there for today. So as usual, I'm available to chat on Twitter at DecentFedPROJ. Alternatively, we'd love it if you hit the like button and engage in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. For those who don't know, depending on how you're taking this in, you can subscribe to the podcast on YouTube by searching Decent Federalism Project, and on most audio podcast platforms by searching Decent Ideas Podcast. We'd also be deeply honored if you share this podcast with a friend on social media. It goes a long way. So next time, we'll discuss a new and hopefully timely issue that deserves a new set of eyes. I'll keep you guessing, as usual, on what's coming next. And until then, be decent to one another. I hope you fare well, and thanks so much for listening.